thank you very much for joining us in this session of An Audience with the President. I'm excited about today. We've got a new topic that we've not covered before, and I know many people are very interested in what we have to say. So my first job is to hand over to the President of the Spiritualist National Union, who will be your host for this session, Minister David Bruton. David.
Thank you very much, Elv, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here again to our regular Monday evening where we talk about all things spiritualism and beyond. And as Elv said, tonight I'm equally looking forward to our discussion, which I'm sure is going to be interesting for everyone. Literature is a very big part in our lives, and we recognise that education is important within our spiritualism, because as exponents of the movement, if we are educated and we take the time to educate ourselves, then we are better exponents and better ambassadors for both the spirit world and also the spiritualist movement. So this evening, we're going to talk about literature, perhaps books from the past that have really, really inspired you, but also about the state of literature today. And things are a little different this week because rather than our usual panel format, tonight we have got just one special guest. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you a lady who is joining us all the way from New York. She's our first transatlantic guest. And Alva and I have got everything crossed that all the technology works. And I'd like to welcome, who is a member of the SNU, an award holder of the SNU, Karen Frances McCarthy. Good evening, Karen, and lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. And just for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm coming from New York, but I'm from Ireland. So you'll probably, that's why you're listening to an Irish accent and not a New York accent.
You would have never got that, Karen, if you hadn't have told us. Okay, so let's introduce Karen, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. Karen Frances McCarthy is a best-selling author, public speaker, and progressive spiritualist medium. She was formerly a skeptic and an atheist and spent many years working as a major media journalist and was also an embedded Iraq war correspondent. What an interesting life you've had, Karen. Fascinating. Her first book, The Other Irish, was supported by the Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs as a cultural outreach in Ireland's cross-border peace process. For this work, she was named one of the top Irish female broadcasters who have made an international impact. Following a tragic loss, which became a catalyst that brought her back to spirituality and reawakened a mediumistic faculty she had had in childhood, today she holds 3 certificates of recognition in mediumship, spiritual healing, and public speaking from the Spiritualist National Union. She has a private mediumship and healing mediumship practice in New York, where she also teaches. She's currently researching a PhD on contemporary ghost literature at Britain's University of Birmingham. Her recently released book, Till Death Don't Us Part, is a true story of awakening to love after life, and has been warmly received around the world and is now an Amazon bestseller. So I think you're our first Amazon bestseller on Audience with the President, Karen. Fantastic, that's wonderful.
Thank you.
So we're going to start by I'm going to ask you a few questions and start our discussion tonight, and then we are going to invite people to join in the discussion and ask your questions. So let's begin. As I've just said from your biography, Karen, you were formerly a skeptic and an atheist. Was that since childhood, or was that a reaction perhaps to your childhood upbringing?
Yeah, I think probably the latter more. So I grew up in Dublin, obviously, and went to Catholic school and the whole thing. And by the time I got to the end of school, I'd had enough. By the time I got out of secondary school in Ireland, it was, I kind of sat down with my mother one day and I said, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to go to mass anymore. I don't have to deal with the nuns anymore. I've had it. And from there, had nothing, no belief system, was just a complete rationalist. If I couldn't see it, it didn't exist sort of thing. Many years later in New York, I got involved with Zen Buddhism. And I must stress with Zen, is non-theistic. It's really more like thought philosophy than a religion. There's no belief in the afterlife or a God or anything like that. So it's basically as non-theistic as you can get. And for me, it just sort of helps to be able to sort of sit and meditate, and that was pretty much the reason why I got into that. And that was about it until the story in the book, those events transpired, and that was really a major jolt out of my sort of rationalistic comfort zone that I was in.
Absolutely. Working as correspondents in Iraq, in a war zone, that had a profound effect upon you?
I'll tell you one thing, I'm never going into another war zone after that. I learned that from that lesson. It's something that I've realized, I actually gave a talk on this yesterday at a service. The thing about being in a war zone is, at the time, obviously, this was before the events of the book happened. So this was when I was a political journalist. I was covering US politics for the Irish Examiner. And then I went out to Iraq for the Irish Times to get what the editor said, the worm's eye view. So I was living in these tents with the soldiers, sleeping on these cots, and the first bit of great advice somebody gave me when I got there was always, when we were on patrol, I was just out in 130-degree heat. I don't know what that is in English. I don't know what that is in Celsius, but it's very hot. And in body armor, anyway, I was just told, put your feet, always put your foot where the soldier in front of you put his foot. And that was the best advice I got. And the reason is because if they didn't get blown up by an IED where they stood, you won't. And I mean, this is what life becomes.
Yes.
That's the most important piece of information you're given. And it's just in a completely different world. And obviously, I grew up in Ireland during the Troubles as well. So it really makes you question the point and the purpose when you start seeing the atrocious things people are capable of doing to each other.
Yes, it seems to make life look very cheap, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and it just makes you question. Why? How are we here? What are we doing? What are we doing to each other?
And how long were you in Iraq?
I was just there for a summer, for a few months. I was there. I swear it was like dog years. I felt bad for the soldiers because they had to do 18-month tours. And I was just, get me out of here. I have some other friends who are journalists, and they stayed, in Baghdad. They had fancy hotels they'd taken over, and they had these great big feasts every night. But I was like, I was told to go out and get the worm's eye view, so I need to get out there and see what the hell's going on. And it was just, I swear, somebody said to me, what was Iraq like? And I said, it was like war. It was just hell. War really is hell.
Yes, I think sometimes we're protected by the media in some respects because we watch it all. It's brought into our homes on a regular basis, but the actual experience. One of my nieces served with the British Army out there, and she was out there for a couple of years, and I know it certainly shaped her life and her opinion of life. Quite an experience at quite a relatively young age.
Yeah.
Let's then move a little bit forward from your work as a journalist and working in Iraq. So from there, did you return to America or come to Ireland?
Well, I come and go from Ireland all the time anyway. So I do spend anywhere from 3, 4, 6 months, sometimes even in Ireland. I came from Iraq. I can't remember. It was like a while ago, that war. I think I came back to New York, and and then and then you're here, and it does, even just a summer in a war zone, when you're out in the middle of it, and you're getting shot at, and when you just don't know where to look or where to stand, and it's because it's very surprising, do you know what I mean? Because it's all very, very stealth, that sort of war, and you're always on edge, permanently on. I know soldiers came back and they jump at the tiniest thing still because their nerves are shot from being there. And I came back here, and I do remember, my patience being quite thin, so I do remember, I'd written all of these stories about this horrendous situation that we were in out there. And then people would just come back and they'd say, oh, what was it like? Like I had been on a, 5-star resort someplace. What was it like? And I would just say, I wrote an awful lot about it. Just go read it. I can't sit here and go over all of that again. So I do know I was quite agitated when I came back, and people, like you say, you just don't, unless you're there, it's very difficult to convey the experience. It's like mediumship, unless you have it, it's very hard to convey the experience. It's one of those things where you really need to experience it to understand it, I think. And as you say, very difficult reading about it, watching it on the news to really get it. I mean, we can hear some personal stories of soldiers and personal stories of, wives and children that were left behind, and they can very, very much touch us. But the actual horror of it is an entirely different thing. So New York seemed very tame, I can assure you, when I came back.
Absolutely. Now, I know this was before you became a spiritualist, but you talk about your sensitivity and your awareness in your childhood.
Yeah.
Did that inform you when you were out in that situation, in a life and death situation, working with people that were in exactly the same situation? How did it affect you from an energetic sense, or your sensitivity?
Well, I never paid much attention to sensitivity one way or the other. I actually, to be honest, David, I didn't even really, wasn't even a word I would have used at that time. I mean, I do remember all throughout my life having intuitive impressions and just thinking it's coincidence or it's logic, or, you know what I mean? But looking back on them now, I go, oh, that was a sensory experience that at the time I just thought, oh, well, that's obvious, So in Iraq, I think, you're in such a heightened state anyway, because you're always on guard, that I really think you're really more just in very, very much survival mode. So I can't remember ever going intuitively, this is something to pay attention on, because you're, like I said, you're literally putting your feet where the soldier in front of you is walking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, and then life changed for you. The story in the book is a remarkable story. It's obviously deeply personal, and equally must have been a very, very difficult time of your life. You write so descriptively of these experiences that you had after the passing of your fiance. Has writing the book helped you personally, do you think?
Yeah, I would definitely say, and in odd ways, and Alva and I spoke about this before. What I found was that, first I had to decide how to write the book. I mean, it took me 10 years to get around to writing it, It took me, he died when I was just finishing my first book, which was the part of the peace process. And then that whole year was sort of dealing with the publishers and then getting that out and promoted and book tours and stuff. But also it took me an inordinately long time to admit to mediumship, even after I'd had the experience of it, even after I'd sat in circles, the only people who knew I had this ability were the people and at the time I was doing it with the SNUI. Yes. So you can sit in your house, you can sit in your, nobody, except the little screen, nobody. And at the time, back in those days, we didn't have this faces. No. You just names in a list, you know, so you could really get into development in a very anonymous way. And so it took me about 5 years even to admit that I was mediumistic. I didn't want anyone to, because I was like, if I start telling my friends that I have this ability, these are my friends from 5 years ago, they're as skeptical as I was 5 years ago. And if I start telling them this, they'll just think I'm nuts. And they'll react to me the way I would have reacted 5 years ago. And I really didn't want to set myself up for that. So it took an awful long time just to admit to it, to be honest. And then eventually I thought, you know, first of all, I need to admit to that. And as I'm sure many people have had this experience, as soon as you come out of the closet, basically, you start finding that quite a lot of people fall away, you know, but what happens then is new people come in, and that there's a large amount of grieving in that, because even just that is a change. But when it came to writing the book, it took me a long time. And then it took me a while to figure out, how am I going to write this book? You know, will I write this like a journalist, like I'm presenting evidence, you know, like Leslie Keane in New York wrote a book, she's a journalist, wrote a book on something like evidence for survival or something, I can't remember the name of it, but and from a journalistic perspective of interviewing people, and I thought, should I do it like that? That's the format and the medium I'm most comfortable in, because there's also a distance, because you're investigating somebody else and you're interviewing somebody else, and you can kind of stay like very anonymously there in the background. And I had kind of thought about that for a while, and then eventually I came to realize, you know, what I can offer with this story is not just I've investigated it from somebody else and I'm now presenting you a bunch of sort of nonfiction facts. I thought what I could do is, if I actually tell of the journey in a way that can read like creative nonfiction, where it's a story that can draw people in and just present the experience, then that's something I can offer that the journalist in me couldn't offer, if you know what I mean. And what I found was, I sat in a writing group and I would read pages, you know, to them, and then you get a bunch of notes, and they'd, you know, what I found was, you know, Alvin, I've talked about this before, was that initially, you know, you're trying to make yourself look, this is the thing about writing about yourself, you kind of, first impulse to make yourself kind of look good, you know, you don't want to make yourself look bad, right? But the writing was terrible, you know, it was very clearly phony, you know, and so it got to a point where I thought, I need to just be very honest about what's going on. And it was just, I just really, really tried to just be very honest about the experiences and my responses to them. And there's certainly some scenes that I included in this book to this day I'm not proud of, like arguing and cursing at my neighbor, and, you know, all of these kinds of things that arise when you do become more sensitive, and everything just initially, you know, most people I'm sure in the room know, initially everything just seems to be like nails on a chalkboard, you know, and until you start getting used to living in this more heightened sensitivity. And I thought all of that needs to be included.
Yes.
Because if I don't include it, I'm just going to sound like I'm trying to whitewash myself. And what I really need to do is just be as honest as I could. And what I actually discovered was two things. One, that the more honest I got on the more granular level, the better the writing became. It became more engaged. And I know you've read it yourself, it became more engaging, just because this was somebody just trying to just tell the story for as honestly as it could be told. And secondly, I found in just being that honest and kind of putting all of that on the page, it actually became quite healing.
Yes.
In odd ways, you know.
Yes, and in turn healing other people as well, which is important, because it is. It's I think I said in the foreword, it is beautifully crafted, and you can feel, you know, the integrity of your writing. You were talking about something that was so personal to you, but in such a way that, as you say, it engages people, and it is a beautiful story, and it just has an authenticity because of that and the way you've approached it. which is good. And I don't think it would have come over in the same way if you'd approached it from the journalistic point of view. You know, I think it very much needed to be from the heart, and that's where it comes from, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah.
So, do you feel that this book just developed naturally, or did you come down to a point where you got up one day and said, I have to put this down in writing?
I stewed on it for some time. You know, I stewed on, like I said, you know, I need to kind of get around. I'd actually researched an entire book on science and spirituality in Ireland, and I was going to sit down and start writing that. I'd spent a whole year doing all of this research on that, buried in Trinity College in Dublin, in the old archives doing that. And then I thought, and then it just got to a point where I thought, I have to get this book out first. And I really just started feeling really compelled that this has to get written first. But I did stew on it for some time. It had been sort of in the back of my head. Should I, maybe I could write it as fiction and then get away with everything, you know, and then that's not really going to stand. That's not, you know, if people are reading it as fiction, I don't see how this is going to help anybody. Then, like I said, I thought maybe I'll just write it as the journalist, and then I can put some distance between me and the story. And then I thought, the thing that's unique about having the mediumistic experience within the spiritualist tradition is that there's a unique perspective there that we can bring to the page that a journalist can't, because they haven't had the experience, if you know what I mean. The other thing too was I had been working towards my CSNUs, and I thought I saw somebody who helped me with my prep for that in the room earlier. But I had done those, and once those were done, then I felt almost like, you know what, that's a huge project. I did 3 of them all in one go. That's a huge project now out of the way. I'm going to sit down and start working on this. So it just sort of things just lined up that way. But I had stewed over the format, you know, and eventually came, and I know at the moment memoirs aren't really flavor of the month within the publishing industry, but I thought, you know, no, I should really just do it, because then it's the truth. And I think this is one of the things you have to do, and I learned this with my first book. You just have to write the book for yourself. You just have to put it down and not worry about what other people are going to say about it. Because the minute you start worrying about, oh, well, they'll think I'm a lunatic, and they'll think I'm this, and they'll think I'm that, that just completely stifles the creative process. And so I tried to just really get into, I wrote every day for a year, and then for 6 months I would, you know, I'd get feedback back from agents and publishers and make changes for about 6 months. But I mean, I just sat down and just sort of wrote it like that, and started, you know, it's like actors say, you kind of have to, at some point you find the voice, yes. You know, and so I found the voice, and once I found the voice, I thought, this is working and I'll stick with it.
So at what stage did you actually make that step into spiritualism, and how did you do that?
Well, as soon as one of the first people I met when the weird things in this, so I was in this big scary house, like that I would call a mausoleum in the book, and people thought I was being facetious, and I was like, no, it really did look like a mausoleum. It was dark, it was all mahogany, it creaked, you know, and I was house sitting there in Virginia, so I didn't want to be in New York. And when all of these kind of odd things, creaking, all of the things that I spent the first 100 pages of the book trying to come to terms with what's going on. One of the first person, strangely enough, as you know, that I met, who I thought all these odd things are happening, and things are moving, electronics are turning on, things are touching me and pulling my hair. So, you know, the first response as a rationalist is, I'm having a nervous breakdown. From grief, you know, but they didn't stop. And I thought, I've always been such a strong-minded individual. How am I cracking like this? And I didn't feel like I was cracking, but I couldn't understand all of this stuff, seeing things. And I actually, as you know, ended up getting lost one day and coming across a tiny little Catholic church in Virginia, and went in and sat in the mass for the first time in like 30 years or something. And it was lovely. you know. And then afterwards I went in to see I thought I'll go in and have an intelligent conversation with the priest about this stuff. And I went into the rectory afterwards, knocked on the door, thinking, getting ready with my, you know, the whole I'm going to interview this priest sort of thing. And he opened the door and looked so compassionate that I just burst into tears, and I was just standing on his porch, like weeping, you know. And he ushered me inside, made me a cup of tea, and told me that these are signs loved ones leave us, which I think the Psychic News did a story on that, because it was such an odd thing to hear a Catholic priest saying, no, other parishioners have had that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I started looking into it, and it turned out that the Reverend Concetti in Rome had issued a statement. Actually, this is one of those typical journalist moments. I came across, I can't remember I think it was one of the English papers. I can't remember which one it was, like the Times, or, you know, and there was a journalist in it had written, the Rome correspondent had written that the Reverend Gino Concetti had raised eyebrows by saying communication with our loved ones is possible after they die, because this is coming from a very high-ranking, you know, bishop or cardinal, whatever he was, within the Catholic structure. And of course, I read this on a second source site, and I had to go contact that journalist. I mean, the story was 12 years old or something. I still tracked down that journalist to get it from the horse's mouth. Did he really say that? Did you really write this? Because I got this from a secondary source, you know. And he said, no, he had written it. And the Reverend Junica said he had said that. And I thought, even though I hadn't been a Catholic for a long time, the fact that an institution that conservative could say this made me go continue. And I started continuing on from that. And the next church I walked into was somebody had said to me, you know, there's a spiritualist church in Norfolk, across the bay in Virginia. And she had said they raise up the dead or summon the dead twice on Sundays or something like this, you know. And but I drove over to this spiritualist church and sat in a spiritualist service, which just seemed like the bizarrest thing to me at the time. And there was just people there just giving messages to people, and it, you know, didn't understand what the hell's going. What is going on? I didn't understand what was going on, you know. But they invited me to sit in a circle in their lyceum after the service, which I did, and that's kind of how I was introduced to spiritualism in the way that, you know, that way. But what became quite apparent the first time I sat in the circle, I got messages from him, and all I could think of was they were giving me all of these, the students and everything were giving me details about Johann, and I was just sitting there looking at them going, how do they know this?
That's amazing, absolutely amazing. I've got to ask you, Karen, you clearly have got experience both sides of the pond. Is American spiritualism different to what you've experienced in the UK?
Well, I think, yes, it's not, there is a spiritualist umbrella organization here, like the NSAC, that's sort of SNU, but the churches seem to sort of do their own thing more than the sort of SNU structure of churches. There are a huge amount of, I don't know Britain now, to be honest. I'm familiar with what goes on in Ireland more than Britain, but there is an awful lot of metaphysical centers, psychic schools, all of these sorts of things that are teaching mediumship and practicing mediumship and doing demonstrations of mediumship, but don't ever do services because they don't consider themselves religious and they're not part of a religious organization. They are everywhere. So there's an awful lot of that. I don't know if that's the same in Britain or not, but I do know that is here.
It is, yes, but yeah, I was just interested in the different experience. Before we actually open up to our audience this evening and allow them to ask you some questions, can I just ask you, what books did you read when you were starting your exploration into spiritualism?
Oh my God, I read everything I could get my hands on almost. And I started off initially reading, you know, the more scientific stuff. So I was reading like the first book that I think I came across was a book by Professor Lulu Grand, who's a psychologist, who had written a book on signs, and I started down that road. Carl Jung, turns out whose family were mediums, and Sheldrake and Dean Radin, and I was reading these types of things because that was all I understood, really, that sort of approach. And then I gradually from there started reading, I came across W.T. Stead, of course, who was a journalist and died on the Titanic. And so one of my favorite books still to this day is The Blue Island, which was channeled for him. And I just really, I really just enjoyed that. I started getting into those more interesting, more imaginative types of books over time. Andrew Jackson Davis, I read part of the Great Harmonia, and then also The Magic Staff, which was this really sweet little book. And I started sort of reading that, and eventually kind of found my way into the sort of Silver Birch and those that sort of literature. But and then also, of course, the likes of Eben Alexander, the near-death experience, the neurosurgeon, knew it. Because for me, it was like, if these people who are absolute rationalists, men of science, can find a way to make this make sense, that really was, I needed that at that time, to read that at that time. And eventually I reread Daniel, the book of Daniel from the Bible, it's full of psychic references and all of this sorts of thing. It's like you start to realize that, all of these things you can read from other alternative perspectives. When I came across Daniel in school, it was just that. But then you have these experiences and it opens your eyes, and then all of a sudden things start looking different.
Yes.
Reread things, and they are filled with a whole different level of meaning.
I had a very similar experience with Findlay. I tried to read Findlay when I was relatively new to the movement and gave up, I have to admit, and came back to it maybe 10, 15 years later, and it just meant so much more. I was really getting the essence of what Findlay has done for the movement. Time is ticking on, Karen, and you and I could, I'm sure, carry on talking for hours and hours and hours. I think it's a spiritualist trait. We love talking, but we've got our audience here. So Alf, can I hand over to you and perhaps ask if anyone would like to get a word in edgeways?
Yeah, I think I could listen as well. It's just amazing how we've all got very, very different journeys into spiritualism, but when you hear someone else's journey, we find those things that correspond. So it's really interesting. So now's the time for you to ask your questions, or if you want to make a comment, please raise your hand. At the bottom of your participants list, you'll find a little button that says raise hand. I've already had questions coming in via the chat box as well. So while we're waiting on you to think of your questions or decide what comment you want to make, I've got a question here. To Karen, obviously, and someone has asked, how do we talk about or write about spiritualism and still make it sound fascinating, which it is, they say, but how do we do that without it being sensationalized or sounding sensational? Is that fine balance, I think they're asking about?
I think, first off, if you're coming from a place of integrity and authenticity, and you really just want to tell the story as well and as richly as the story existed, and as I said earlier, just writing it for yourself or to have meaning for yourself, and not worrying about your audience, I feel like you need to come from that place as you're writing it. It's if you start getting into, let me ham this up, or let me throw in a bunch of adjectives, or let me sort of go off, and you're getting into the realm of fiction there. So I do feel if you can stick with the facts and just tell those facts well and honestly, then I think you can avoid that turning into something sensational or reality TV or whatever. Do you know what I mean? I think the key is right from the heart, from what's true, from what is meaning. And the more I feel of yourself that you can put into that, the more authentic it will end up being.
We've got questions coming in, and someone's asking, do you think that the role of books has been overtaken by the internet? And what role do books play now, especially in spiritualism?
Yeah. It's amazing how many people say, oh, I don't really read. It's a casualty of, the limits, our shrinking attention span. I mean this in very, very general terms, just as sort of society. But the thing, first of all, there's no question that books contain knowledge, and that's always knowledge we need. I would love to see people, and as a former journalist, I can say this all the time, the amount of stuff I see people tweeting and posting and this, that, and the other, that's none of it sourced, drives me up the wall, because it's like you're just passing along jargon, that is not even true. And if we stopped and we actually had the time, or took the time and made the time to really check, is any of this true? Do I believe in it? We would be so much better off. Books are, I love books. I saw Paul Gaunt in here earlier. I don't know if he's still here. There is no substitute for books. The one thing I will say now is, audiobooks are really good. So if you spend a lot of time in the car, or a lot of time in public transportation, you can still go for that option to basically listen to the book, which is an easy thing to do. Sometimes we come home, we've been at work, we've been doing whatever, there's kids everywhere, you're trying to find time to sit down and read, and it's a very hard thing to do. But I would recommend and encourage people, if there's an audiobook and you're busy, get the audiobook and listen to it on the subway or the train or in the car or whatever. But there's no substitute for finding good books and reading them. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but the more informed we are, the better off we all are.
Fantastic. And I think, yes, definitely a huge encouragement for people to read. And from what you were saying earlier, Karen, it formed a really important part of your journey when you couldn't get your hands on enough things to read, particularly at the beginning. I think many people recognise that. So Sophie is asking in the chat box here, she says, hi, Karen. What psychic or spiritual awareness communication do you currently have with your loved one, Johan? How much do you feel was his intention for your book to be written? Or did this simply come from your grief and perhaps your own soul journey? So a big question there. I hope that makes sense. I wrote it properly.
Well, the first part of the question is in the book. It's all in the book, because the book, as my publisher John Beecher said, this is a love story. I don't publish love stories. This is the first response. But then he read it, and he said he read it till the end, and he said, no, we're going to do it because it's the whole story of spiritualism, of mediumship, of consciousness, of continuity, sort of wrapped up in this love story, which I think is the reason why it's readable, why it's easy to read, because there's this sort of relationship and this character arcs to follow through it. So I would say to the first part of that question is, it's all what I wrote in the book is the way that relationship continues towards, as we go along. And the second half of the book, it's his intention. Well, I kind of had to sit down at one point and say, what, we need to write that. He was an intensely private person. And I was like, he's going to hate this book going out there, But at one point I said, what, we have to do this. I'm not too keen on having to broadcast, all of this to the world, or, my own shadows and things I'd rather people know. I'm not particularly keen on that either, but really, we really need to do this because, I had written an article that Salon ran, which was very unusual. It was a political magazine, and thousands of people responded to it. And that was just 1,200 words version of the story. And I thought we need to do this because, an awful lot of people are don't understand mediumship, they don't understand spiritualism, they are running into an awful lot of superstition. There's an awful lot of harm being done to people. And we're in a position where we can contribute to lessening that for a lot of people potentially. And I was like, we have a responsibility in the end to make this contribution. So I kind of felt initially it was a reluctant agreement on his part, but I do know that it was, it was important. It was like, it's getting written. It's getting written. If he wanted to pull a few strings and make sure a publisher never returned my email or whatever, that was on him. But I was like, this book has to be written. We have to use it's such an interesting and experience that an awful lot of people relate to. It has to be done. So I did feel like he wasn't too happy about it. I must have been a good halfway into the book before I started feeling like that pull was lessening, But, as we know, he's in the spirit world. He knows better than me what has to be done. So that was my logic.
I'm sure he's going around the spirit world saying it's a bestseller now. So, he's got that on him, hasn't he?
Maybe.
There's another question come through. I can't believe how shy people are being tonight. But someone is saying that they've always wanted to blog, and asks, was writing the book painful? And does knowing that people are reading your story make you feel self-conscious? Because I think our questioner here is, perhaps that vulnerability that we sometimes feel when we share things, particularly writing, because once it's in writing and it's published, whether that's online or in print, it's permanent, isn't it?
Yeah, there's no going back once it's out there. Yeah, and I actually say at one point in the book, I can't remember my own direct quote, but it was something like, our shadows are never as destructive out in the light as they are whistling around in the dark. And I do feel that when we can live sort of more with an open book, then we're not always trying to hide some shadow part of us. We're able to sort of shine a light on those parts of us. I mean, when we really think about it, if you're afraid that somebody's going to know something about you, well, it's because if you really think about that, I don't want them knowing this about me, or, if we're self-conscious of something, it's because we feel there's something wrong with us. Or I don't want them to know that. Why would you not want somebody to know something? Because you feel something is wrong with you, or you feel ashamed of something. And this is all, we're carrying that stuff with us all of the time. And the best I realized, and this is why I was saying writing the book in a way was healing, was because the more I just said, you know what, just put it out there. I'm tired of carrying around these shadows. You just put them out there and then they're gone, And you have to, though, understand that everybody has an opinion and their opinions don't matter, frankly. And I say that with the best of intentions. But what I realized very quickly was the people who are, and forgive the word, and I don't mean to say this, but the only word I can use is we're in a culture where what I call the trolls always show up first. They're always the one with the negative comments, the negative reviews, the negative whatever. But we either are going to be victimized by that, controlled by that, we're going to hide from that, or we're just going to stand out and say, this is the truth. Take it or leave it, I don't care. Our job is just to tell the truth. How it's received is their business. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to invite Kay to unmute her microphone and come into the room and to ask you a question or make your point. Are you there, Kay? I can't. We'll go back to Kay. If you can find your microphone and switch it on, we can go back to you. We're having trouble getting your microphone. One of the things that I wanted to ask Karen, and it's something that we talked about before, and I think it's something that's of concern to all spiritualists and should be quite rightly of concern to all spiritualists. We're living in the here and now, and we've talked about the fantastic literature of the past. We've already mentioned W.T. Stead, Arthur Findlay, and the legacy of their books that we now have access to today. What are the kind of stories about our experiences and our identities? What is it about our experience today, do you think, that we need to perhaps explore more, or perhaps to put out there more to help people understand about spiritualism now, but, you know, to those who will come generations ahead of us?
Well, I think when we talk about those writers we talked about earlier, they were writing of their time, you know, and all writing, all literature is of its time. This is how we have, this is just the nature of also all artistic work that we leave. There are genres and there are times. And I feel now is there's great scope for a whole variety of ways of exploring these subjects that we're concerned with. So I know there's an awful lot of NDE literature, there's an awful lot of OBE literature, and all of it is valid. We are of an age now where the experiences and the cultural narratives and the cultural influences of where we are in the 21st century are very different from the mid 20th century or the late 1900s or the late 1800s. You know, we really need to carve out what is our genre now. And I feel that there's an awful lot of people just sort of writing books and getting them out there, and they're really more marketing tools than they are really taking the time to vet, to sit with writing groups, to get feedback, to make sure the writing is relatable, to make sure it's authentic, to make sure it can carry and engage people, that to send to publishers so that it gets editorial oversight, so that it has to reach a standard before it can go on a shelf. I think that's very important. I would really like to encourage people to spend more time really writing from the heart, writing the best they can write, you know, themselves, working with an editor, working with a publisher, working with writing groups to really bring the level and the standard of the writing up so that it can appeal beyond our circles, you know, because the thing is it's easy to write a book, and it comes back to the question the lady earlier asked. It's easy to write a book and only have and self-publish it, knowing that it's only really going to go as far as your own circle, you know, because then what happens is you're not setting yourself out, you're not pushing against the edges. It's when we start trying to reach beyond our circle into the people like I used to be, or into the people. There are so many people, as you know, out there that are hurt and bereaved and will never find their way into a spiritualist church, you know, could never really probably sit in front of a medium. But if somebody could present a story to them that they can be engaged with, it can possibly have them go and inquire about a church or inquire about a medium. And what was happening there is we're reaching beyond the church doors. And I feel that's very, very important. And I feel like the way to reach beyond the church doors is really good, high standard literature. So either it's a very good study like Leslie Kean's or like Eben Alexander's, where it's an unexpected person or especially Eben Alexander, because that was a personal experience. The fact that he was a neurosurgeon made a lot of people like me who otherwise couldn't have gotten on board go, if he found some sense in it, maybe it's worth looking into. And I feel like if we start pushing against the edges and start reaching beyond our immediate circle, then we can find a way to start reaching out to people who just need a way to believe. And the reason I wrote my book the way I did in the end was, let me just present the story, and it'll either resonate with somebody or it won't. And if it resonates with them and it gets them to go into a church or talk to a medium, or even just start to read some of the spiritualist literature or the other literature we've mentioned, its job is done. You know, it's brought a new world and a new frontier to people. And I would really like to see spiritualist literature start to reach those new frontiers. And I feel the way it does that is by really good quality writing, authentic writing, working with editors, working in writing groups, making sure it makes sense. It's very difficult, and I know this as a writer, just to sit in your room and just write a book at yourself and send it out into the world. It goes through, I mean, my book is 30 pages shorter than the original draft, you know, just from getting notes back and being very scrutinizing it and having the editorial oversight of the publisher. And I would really like to see people push themselves to really share a story in this, and push the level, push up the bar and share these stories, because that, I feel, is what's going to help push the edges.
I think that's great advice, Karen, and I really hope that it really encourages people that the time to start that journey is now and not to wait. And I dare say there's a fair few spiritualists who are in this meeting at the moment who are the kind of people who stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning talking to people about their experiences and the impact of spiritualism on their life, and the kind of people who you let slip that you're a spiritualist and you end up spending hours talking to them because they're fascinated, because they're interested. And I guess if we can really take charge of that narrative and to start thinking about it, then, you know, we have that way forward into providing literature for future generations.
Yeah, and if I can just say, for anybody who's thinking about writing their own story, it sounds like a very, I mean, I've been writing for donkeys of years, you know, so I kind of know how to get into it. But I also know this, you can get, the blank page, it can be a terrifying experience, you know. And so what I would say to anybody who is interested is, don't think about it, I've got to sit down and write 250 pages here. Or I've got to start, what's my opening sentence? Like Joyce Carol Oates, the fabulous writer, said, you cannot write the first sentence until the last one is written. Forget it. Start anywhere. Just write any scene anywhere. Just sit down one day, and if it's a scene from the middle of your book and it's only a page and a half long, sit down and write it. The next day, write another scene. Just write them. Just get them down. And when you've got them all down, then you can go back and start organizing them and editing them together. But just break it down into these tiny little things, like you're just going to write a little essay today from any random place in your book, you know, and just write a couple of pages and just leave that be. And the next day write something else. And it doesn't have to be, I've written page 1, now I have to write page 2. You know, I mean, the whole beginning of my book is very different from the original draft. You know, you just sit with it, you move it around. I would say just try to enjoy the process, you know, and not be intimidated by it. I can't overemphasize the importance of finding a good writing group, because you've got an audience as you go. And they can give you a good writing group and give you some feedback that you can sort of take on board or not if you don't want to. But it helps you share, like, and that was very important with this book, because my writing group weren't spiritualists or immediately, just regular writers, you know. You know, the thing about this was, there was things that I took for granted that were self-evident. And they were like, I don't understand how that worked. You know, and it made me go back and have to really explain the communication, that all of these things that we take for granted, you know, that you actually realize this needs to be over explained. And if I hadn't sat in the group for people to go, I don't understand how that happened, or what that means, I wouldn't have known to go, I need to go back and explain all of this. So the group is very important. An editor is very important. A good publisher is very important. But I would just take this one page at a time. Don't think about a whole book. You'll never write a word.
One page at a time. What fantastic advice. We're pushing now to the end of our hour, into the last few minutes. So I'm going to hand back to Minister David Bruton for his closing remarks. David.
Thank you, Alv. And thank you, Karen. It's been a fascinating hour. It really wasn't long enough. I'm sure we could have covered many more areas, and I hope our audience have enjoyed our evening together. and it's been very special for me. I've enjoyed it, and maybe it's encouraged one or two people to think about the importance of reading, and then obviously taking that extra step and putting the pen to the page and starting on the journey of writing. I'd like to just give you a little bit of an insight into what's coming up. Next week, the 23rd of November, we're actually going to take a break. My heavy schedule, I have a meeting that I have to attend that I'm not going to be able to make next Monday. But the following Monday, on the 30th, we will be joined with a lady who was one of our most popular contributors in the last run. And I speak, of course, of Mavis Patilla, OSNU. Mavis will be with us on the 30th of November. We haven't quite nailed down the subject that we're going to talk about yet, but I can assure you we're going to have a brilliant and interesting night with Mavis. On the 7th of December, I'm going to welcome a very good friend to Audience with the President, and that is Tony Ortson, who is the editor of Psychic News. And Tony is going to come along and spend an evening with us, and we're talking about spiritualism, journalism again, and Tony has made an incredible contribution to spiritualist journalism over the years, and I know you will find that a fascinating evening. We're working towards the 14th. I have one or two proposals in the early stages, but until they're confirmed, I'll share those with you later. So thank you all for joining us this evening. I would like to just mention before we go, in our first run, we had regular attendees, Minister Barry Oates and his wife Caroline. As many of you will be aware, Caroline took a transition to the spirit world yesterday, and she's been ill for a little while, and I know Barry and her had been married for over 60 years. They were absolutely dedicated to each other, and perhaps tonight, in your quiet times, send out a thought for Barry and for his family and for Caroline. She spent a lifetime dedicated to the movement of spiritualism, and now she's in the spirit world. Knowing Caroline, her work is certainly going to continue. So in concluding, I want to give Karen a great big thank you for joining us from New York. That sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Live from New York. Thank you, Karen. And I also encourage all of you to read Karen's book, Till Death Don't Us Part. It's fascinating. It's a lovely story. And whether you've been a spiritualist for 10 minutes or 50 years, I know that you'll enjoy the story that Karen has put there into her book. So thank you everybody for joining us. See you, remember, the 30th of November, 7 o'clock with Mavis Patilla. Thank you so much indeed. Good night and God bless.
Thank you, David. Before you all go, if you want to read some more about what Karen has to say, if you're an individual member, your SNU Today should be coming through your letterbox very soon. And there's an article in there that Karen and I did earlier this year that really explores some of the issues that we did touch upon today. There are more online activities for you to join in. On Friday at 6:30 UK time, we have our weekly healing service. And this week, we have Minister Myra Hibbert, who is going to be leading us through that. And on Sunday at 6:30, there is a divine service online as well. And there are other talks that take place each week. If you visit SNUI's website, which is snui.org, you'll be able to access the tuition program and find out what are the open access sessions that are available to you. We talked about Mavis as well. If you visit arthurfindleycollege.org, you'll find details of a 2-evening event that Mavis is doing as a fundraiser for the college, because obviously the college is closed at the moment and needs that support from us all. And that's going to take place on the 16th and the 18th of December. And it's a 2-evening event. On those evenings, there will be a discussion with Mavis and special guests. And then on the next night, on the 18th, there will be a demonstration of mediumship. Those of you who've seen Mavis work before will know that that's going to be pretty special. And so that's a lovely event in the run up to Christmas as well. So join us next time. This session will shortly be available on Facebook in the next day or so, and on our YouTube channel, which is SNU Film. So we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, David. And a big thanks to Karen for such a wonderful evening. Take care, everyone. God bless, and see you next time. Thanks, everyone.